In my last lecture, I downloaded a lot of information. Today, my plan is for you to spend less time dozing to my disembodied voice and more time sharing insights with your classmates. Our focus will again be comparing works across cultures and gleaning insights into those cultures from their art. Let's start with the last work we examined, the Niobedes Crater. Like the Last Judgment of Hunefer, this work contains a narrative of human encounters with the gods. In both cases, the gods have the final word, but otherwise the narratives are very different. How are they different, and which narrative do you think comes closer to the narratives we encounter in our Christian tradition? Oddly enough, since we think of ourselves as much closer culturally to the Greeks than to the Egyptians, in moral and theological terms, we're probably more comfortable with the Egyptian narrative. The Egyptian gods dispense judgment based on human choices of right or wrong. The Greek gods pretty much display petty vengeance. What stylistic similarities and differences do you notice between these two works? Well, there are similarities. The figures are mostly in profile, although some of Niobe's children are shown in three-quarters view. The gods are somewhat higher than the mortals. That's actually more pronounced in the Greek painting. But even though both narratives include movement, only the Greek figures really seem to move through space. The unchanging world of Egyptian cosmology has given way to a more dynamic, but really more disturbing vision. And here we see two processions, representatives bringing tribute to the emperor of Persia at Persepolis, and Athenians bringing tribute to the goddess Athena on the Parthenon of the Acropolis. This is another of the 6 required works from the Acropolis. We've talked about the Panathenaic procession. You've now learned something about the Persians. The procession you see here on the upper image, from the staircase leading to the platform of the king's great audience hall, or Apadana, probably depicts the New Year's festival procession of representatives of 23 subject nations of the Persian Empire. I tried to blow up the faces, not entirely successfully. Again, what similarities do you see? In both cases, the faces are quite serene, but it seems to me that the Greek faces are somewhat more individual and expressive. On the other hand, the Greeks' clothing is very similar, while the figures on the Persian frieze are dressed differently. And why? Well, actually, the similarity and difference in clothing takes us to the very heart of the differences between these processions and, indeed, these cultures. In Persepolis, the representatives of 23 nations are bringing tribute to the Persian king. They are dressed in the clothing of their own regions. In Athens, the processors are all Athenian, although I'd note that the women, even though they are probably daughters of high-ranking families, are not citizens, and they are all dressed in clothing typical of Athens. Persepolis is an empire. Greece is a democracy of sorts. The Persepolis frieze celebrates the diversity of an empire, but also the sovereignty of the kings. The Greeks are celebrating themselves, as well as their goddess Athena. And even she, like all of the Greek pantheon, seems to be made in a human image. The collision between the Greek city-states and the mighty multicultural Persian Empire would shape the history of the world for centuries. Europeans and their descendants have usually celebrated the Greek victory as a triumph for humanism, for self-determination, and in some cases even for democracy, although the Greek city-states were by no means all democracy, and Sparta was a famous military dictatorship. One reason why I really like the crash course video on Greeks versus Persians that we assigned for homework is it gives a rather different slant to this tale. So, according to John Green, what's to like about the Persians? Well, there's quite a lot to like, as you learn. They were religiously tolerant. They allowed subject peoples to keep their leaders and their religions as long as they did not rebel against Persian rule, and they didn't keep slaves. So here's the first of the 2 College Board images from Darius's capital of Persepolis in modern-day Iran, an overview of the Apadana, or audience hall, and especially its huge stone pillars. And here you see the second required image, the grand staircase with its famous processional frieze that we've just looked at. I added the double-headed griffin capital, which is also from Persepolis, mostly because I think it's cool. It is so hard to get a sense of these vast public spaces just from a photo, so let's watch a brief video from UNESCO, the UN's major cultural organization. Here you see a few more photos of the staircase that we can only distantly see in the College Board's required image. What messages do you think are sent by the upward movement of the tribute bearers? Well, they need to ascend to the level of the king, right? And what about the lion attacking the bull? both animals that are traditional symbols of strength. Actually, art historians dispute this last question rather vigorously. One interpretation is that the lion represents the sun and the bull, the moon, and that this represents day defeating night, so maybe it represents the enlightenment of Persian rule. Note how many public spaces relate in some way to the movement of the heavens. It's worth thinking about why that's true. And now, believe it or not, I'm almost done talking. You will be spending the rest of the class making comparisons among 6 public spaces, all pictured on this slide. Mrs. Whitaker will break you into groups where we want you to brainstorm about how the big 4, function, content, context, and form, can be used to describe the public space you've been assigned. You should check your workbook notes, and on Canvas, you will also see links to websites that offer more information. Pay special attention to the kinds of processions or ceremonies that were performed in these spaces and how the spaces accommodated and reinforced these ceremonies. Good luck.